What I see happening, particularly in Catholic discourse at the moment, is that we've been so kind of uprooted from our own liturgical traditions that we have a kind of meta approach to them now. We see them from outside, and we're just constant kind of critics over what makes for a good liturgy and what doesn't. So when we're not passive recipients being sacramentally transformed, it's just a kind of thing over which to have debates and to fall out. And at the same time, we've become kind of largely blind to the natural world because we think that everything is about getting our abstractions right, which is actually, funnily enough, a consequence of the Cartesian spell.
Seems to be working all right. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm here with author Sebastian Morello to talk about his book titled Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries, and talking about kind of what he's written in that book. If anyone is interested, I'd highly recommend the book, to be honest. I know that there's some criticism, I would say, on it, but I thought it was absolutely the book itself is magical, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for joining me today, Sebastian. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So the first thing I kind of want is to just get some definitions and stuff a little bit in order that I think are important to this. And so in a large part in the beginning of the book, you kind of criticize Cartesian thought, and that rationality kind of overtook the faith a little bit. Can you define for me a little bit what that comes from and what Cartesian thought is, and what you mean by rationality taking over the faith?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but essentially I approach Descartes because I'm trained as a philosopher. So when I think about the scientific revolution, it's the method of science that Descartes tried to develop rather unsuccessfully, actually, as it happens. But more importantly, his way of responding to the rise or the return of atomism, which of course is a very ancient way of looking at the world, that the world is formed of atomic and subatomic structures. The popularizer of this way of thinking in the ancient world was Democritus, and people thought they were doing something very innovative in the 17th century by coming up with various theories of atomism, but actually they were kind of retrieving an ancient heresy, really. Democritus said that when he put food into his mouth, the smell of the food and the taste of the food, these were really just projections of his mind, because of course what he was really putting in his mouth was colourless, tasteless, scentless atoms. And so when in the 17th century, people who trying to make philosophical sense of what was being posed in the scientific revolution, particularly by Galileo, who was a very forthright atomist, when people started making a distinction between primary and secondary qualities, that the primary qualities were things that were quantifiable and measurable, and the secondary qualities were things like color and scent and derivative values like beauty and various other aesthetic categories. That these secondary qualities were not things that inhered in the things themselves, but they inhered in the mind, and we projected them onto the world around us. What they were essentially doing was they were leveling the entire universe and making it one great mass of purposeless, meaningless atomic structures, and all the things that we love about the world and all the ways that we derive meaning and purpose from the world were actually projections of our minds. And Descartes basically gives us the anthropology for this, that there's the res extensa, the stuff extended in space and time with which we're surrounded, and then there is the res cogitans, the cloistered inner realm of meaning and purpose that we identify with selfhood, or the I, as Kant will later put it. And the fact is that the scientific community, as Wolfgang Smith famously demonstrated, or at least famously among those who read him with enthusiasm, this kind of Cartesian bifurcationism, as Whitehead called it, has persisted in the scientific community, but it's also filtered down and become just the way we think about the world. And people are obsessed with finding and discovering and celebrating the inner authentic self that is not really fully disclosed to anyone else and is pre-social and pre-political. This is so it has huge political and social and moral ramifications, this way of seeing the world. And I suppose the point that I want to maintain is that actually this is all a big superstition. It's total nonsense. And what it has done is it has gouged our eyes out. We can no longer see the world. The universe is no longer disclosed to us. I mean, it's disclosed to us as vast amounts of stuff, but it's not disclosed to us as divine communication, which is the patristic conception of the world, which is largely adopted by Christianity, but is already the primary way of understanding a kind of theocentric cosmology within the world's sapiential traditions. It's the cosmology that's indigenous to ancient Egypt, to the Mediterranean. Obviously, it's developed in a creative way, largely in opposition to the rise of the church by Plotinus and his followers. But it plays a major part in Eastern religions as well, particularly in Hinduism. People tend to identify Vedantic philosophy, for example, almost exclusively with Shankara. But Shankara is not, as I've been learning increasingly of late, is not the primary authority of Vedanta in the East. And the Vedanta has much more of this kind of cosmos as theophany conception. And so the reason why I'm just noting that this is a kind of shared vernacular of the great sapiential traditions is that it helps us to understand how bizarre it is that a kind of niche heresy of the ancient world, namely Democritan atomism, has become the dominant way of understanding the world in the modern age, despite its, counterintuitive character. So we're now because I'm interested in the way that angelic and demonic forces operate in a kind of quotidian sense, because we tend to only think of demonic and angelic forces in terms of whether you pray to your guardian angel or whether somebody gets possessed, or so in these kind of very particular cases. But actually, in the medieval cosmos, angels are implicated in everything. If plants are growing, the angels are involved in that. If it's a windy day, as it is today, and it's pouring down with rain, the angels are orchestrating this. If the planets are moving, it's because the angels are moving them. The angels are implicated in every aspect of the created order, but they also play as it's quite clear from medieval and patristic and Desert Father psychology, they play a huge role in the way we think. And the church has, up until fairly recently, had a kind of angelological psychology. And so I try to understand this Cartesian bifurcationist mind virus in angelic terms, and I refer to it as the hex in my book. And it's this hex, this dark curse, that has corrupted and corroded the modern mind and left us completely sightless to the enchantment of the created order, that I suppose my book was a small attempt to break. So there's a kind of whistle-stop tour of what I'm trying to do there.
Yeah, that has so many implications of what you just said that we can take another hour of the conversation just talking about that bit you just said there. But one thing I do want to point out based on what you said, and it's kind of ironic, is the fact that it sounds like Cartesian kind of directs a little bit towards materialism, but in a weird irony, it actually our lives become less incarnational. It almost becomes de-incarnational by doing that. And so, it's kind of like this, the scientist that has this like tunnel vision at looking at the little, organism, whatever, under the microscope, while missing the bigger picture of everything that's around him in a way. And with that, it seems that has also affected the way we read something like fairy tale stories or scripture.
Sure.
Where, for example, if we read for something like the creation story in Genesis or Jonah and the whale or something like that, our immediate thought, instead of thinking about what does this mean, or what is it trying to tell us, to this language of, do you think that God actually created the world in 7 days? It's kind of an irrelevant question because that's not what it's trying to answer in a way. So, with that, with the book, in what way can people take steps to kind of break this spell, I guess. So how can we kind of bring back this kind of like incarnationality, if that's even a term, kind of like this incarnational living into our life, in the same way that you spoke that in medieval thing, like the angels, kind of this participation between man and angel and this incarnational magic aspect kind of happening there. How do we bring that back in our modern day lives?
Yeah. So in a practical way, you mean, I suppose, the church has historically claimed that there are kind of two books of Revelation. There's the book of Revelation of Holy Writ, where God has, if you like, entered history from without through his covenantal relationships, first with the Hebrews, the people of Israel, and then with the new Israel, and the new Israel is the church. And so he has these, he's established these covenantal bonds, and he's universalized that ultimately through baptism. And we have the story of that, and we have the story of that in Holy Scripture. And that's one book of Revelation. But there is also this primordial book of Revelation. And the primordial book of Revelation is the created order itself. And my own view is that we have to induct ourselves, or be inducted very deeply, into both books of Revelation. Valentin Tomberg, of whom I'm a great enthusiast, although I understand that a lot of people have their reservations about about the contribution he made to 20th century Catholic discourse. But one of the things that Tomberg says is that the church has always needed two kinds of theologian. The theologians of Holy Writ and the theologians of the world, he says. And the theologians of the world are those who are able to decipher and detect and to communicate the universe's theophanic language. And so I think that given that modernity is largely a process of deracination, of being uprooted from a sense of place, uprooted from pieties and bonds, uprooted from our received traditions. And given that I don't really believe, well, not that I don't really, I really, really do not believe in the pre-political, pre-social authentic self. I think that what we are as selves emerges out of our induction into tradition and into our communities and into our history and into our bonds and our pieties. Well, the antidote to deracination is initiation. The antidote to being uprooted is to be initiated or reinducted back into whatever our own sacred inheritance is. And so, I suggest various ways of doing that. The primary way is to reconnect with our ancient liturgies. One of the great tragedies of the 20th century, in my view, is that the church, rather than responding to modernity as a process of deracination that's dehumanizing us and stripping us of our personhood, given that personhood is a moral relation between rational agents that isn't just with those rational agents with which we share the world at the moment, but it's in that Burkean sense a conversation through the generations, that I'm morally implicated in the lives of my ancestors because they have handed me something and prepared to do so, and I'm morally implicated in the coming generations because I have to hand a world on to them that can still speak of its creator. Because of that relationality that makes us persons, any great assault on tradition, any great assault on your inheritance is a way of stripping you of your personhood. And so the church in the mid-20th century, rather than responding to this process of deracination that is the chief characteristic of modernity, by being the great bulwark of tradition, it actually vastly accelerated that process of deracination by taking a sledgehammer to the ancient liturgy and covering the ancient continent in kind of ugly church architecture and abusing the sanctuaries and doing all of these things. And of course, the response, and it was actually quite a reasonable response, of a lot of the faithful was, well, we're leaving then, and we're never coming back. And so what the 20th century saw was this astonishing apostasy. And what I think, institutions make mistakes. That's a heck of a mistake to make, but institutions make mistakes. What I think is particularly heartbreaking is for the church now to have over half a century of experience of what such trauma does to the church and does to the faithful, and now in our own age to double down on treating or mistreating the faithful in this way, which is what Rome has been doing recently. Now, it seems to me that what the church needs to do is exactly the opposite. It needs to start reinducting and reinitiating the faithful into their ancient tradition, so that they don't have to be dragged along in the modern process of deracination, which will leave us all slaves. And so that's the first step, I suppose, which is to be heirs again to our own sacred inheritance. But there's also the primordial book of Revelation, and somehow we need to re-establish some kind of connectivity with the natural world again. Right now, the way in which our kind of hyper-industrialized, inordinately capitalist, late modern civilization, and I use that word kind of euphemistically, the way that it is operating is damaging the natural world, of which we ourselves are a part. So in the end, we're going to get poisoned, and we already are, to the most extraordinary degree. And given that this is God disclosing himself through the created order, this is a kind of sacrilege. If the cosmos is a sacrament, as the Church Fathers, as Gregory Nazianzen says, then this is a form of desecration. And the fact that, people have decided that somehow it's kind of right wing to throw plastic into the ocean or something, it has shown how much we've kind of lost our grip on a sane approach to this discussion. Now, obviously, it's not up to each individual to save the whole planet, but what he can do is establish a connectivity with the natural world again. The way that I've done that in my own life is to eat a lot of wild food, and I do a lot of hunting and foraging, and I have very close relations with the surrounding countryside community here. But there are many ways that people can do this, but there is an imperative here. Now, what I see happening, particularly in Catholic discourse at the moment, is that we've been so kind of uprooted from our own liturgical traditions that we have a kind of meta approach to them now. We see them from outside, and we're just constant kind of critics over what makes for a good liturgy and what doesn't. So when we're not passive recipients being sacramentally transformed, it's just a kind of thing over which to have debates and to fall out. And at the same time, we've become kind of largely blind to the natural world because we think that everything is about getting our abstractions right, which is actually, funnily enough, a consequence of the Cartesian spell. The turn to the subject is essentially to privilege turning inward to the ideas hovering in the mind. And to prioritize and privilege those above the concrete realities that make up the web of relations in which we subsist. And so, you mentioned that there's been some negative reaction to my book, Mysticism, Magic and Monasteries. I haven't sort of lost any sleep over that reaction, largely because to the degree I've been exposed to it, it's been so obvious to me that my critics are themselves completely under the hex of this Cartesian curse. And so I sort of think, well, of course you're not going to like the book, are you? So that's what I would suggest to people, to take those two books of Revelation, which after all is all that's available to us, and to go through that rigorous process of initiation and reinduction into a life of connectivity with those. The alternative is just to be yet another screen addicted, zombie staring at Instagram and desperately like a vampire trying to suck meaning out of what's already dead.
Yeah, it's how do I explain it? It's we all the way we function now. It's almost like we're these disconnected observers that are like disconnected from the world, and we just look at it as if we're not a part of it. And so that's where you have sometimes I feel like this, if you want to call it like this phenomena where, like, for example, in the church constantly pushes and you have all these Eucharistic conferences and stuff like it's the real body and blood of Christ. But then when you go to a church, they don't participate in it as if it's the real body, right? And so they tell you, and then you go to participate with it. And some churches, they treat it like an airport terminal or something. And there's like, no, that you lose that sense. And so that's, I think, an example of how sometimes we feel like it's enough to just tell someone something so they know, instead of what you mentioned of like this initiation to participate with that thing, right? So yes. I can say like this spot here is super holy, but if I'm just doing everything I do normally that I do at home in that same spot, the other person, it's difficult to keep that spot holy if you don't treat it as if it's holy.
Sure.
That's that.
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting things that whilst participation and active participation were real buzzwords in the 20th century regarding how we were going to reconnect with our own religious practice, in reality, everything became meta. We started to see everything from without. And even, I remember going to Novus Ordo liturgies back in the day, and, people would say things like, and now we're going to say the responsorial psalm. And so, you're sort of being, you've got a kind of running commentary, and then they would sort of say a verse, and then they would say, please respond. And you would all sort of say the response. So you had, it was like having this running commentary on your activity, so that you never saw it from within. You never actually participated. You were always getting the stage directions. You were always seeing it from without, and so, but this came so naturally to people who already thought that the reason why you would attend a liturgy at all was to discover and celebrate you becoming your authentic self. And so the churches went from being cruciform to being round, and everyone had to face each other, and everyone had to stop in the middle of the Eucharist so they could shake each other's hand, and all of this kind of stuff, because it all became about the authentic self. So this whole Cartesian superstructure got placed on top of the church. And of course, as I think I mentioned in the first chapter of the book, the Dominican friar Fergus Kerr, in his book, I think it's Theology After Wittgenstein, it shows over and over again, he's almost relentless, quote after quote after quote, showing how some of the key advisors at the Second Vatican Council had a completely Cartesian anthropology. So it's a kind of amazing thing that that it took us several hundred years to do what, in a way, the unthinkable, which is take all of the prejudices and assumptions, which are basically superstitions, from the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and transpose them into almost every domain of traditional Catholic practice. So the hex that I refer to is much more serious and far-reaching than a lot of people realize. So the book's purpose was largely to try and draw attention to that, I suppose.
Yeah, another thing I kind of want to touch on with all this is, if you want to say, like, go down a couple levels of the hierarchy of kind of like worship, is that I really spoke to me, because I feel the same way, was when you talked about, for example, the this new age practice of having crystals and them saying that it's like healthy or something, and then the church, there's certain exorcists and stuff online that say like these crystals are kind of inherently demonic, right? And so, but you read somebody like Saint Hildegard von Bingen or like any of the medieval saints and stuff like that, and there's a large part in that crystals are used for healing purposes, or like there's a participation with the natural world, as we kind of mentioned earlier, that you can bring on to kind of like live incarnationally, right? So when you grow an apple tree or something, some of the gospels or parables that you read come a little more alive with what you're doing. But with this modern kind of viewpoint, there's just like these things are inherently evil. Like, don't, it's almost, saying crystals are evil is almost, might as well say that you can't go to the local garlic festival because they worship garlic too much or something, so that's evil in a way. You know what I mean? There's like this act there. So how do you I guess the question kind of is it even possible to fight this when you have, obviously I think people should listen to their exorcists and like confessors and things like that, but I think it's a little problematic when you hear language like that saying that a creation of the world is inherently evil if there wasn't already some kind of evil participation around it, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like a tree, I don't think is evil, but if there have been occult practices that happen there, you obviously want to draw clear from there, because there is an evil presence there that was invited. So, how do you, I guess, live this incarnational spirit with our natural world, and recognize that there's beauty in nature? Why, when there's basically clergy and stuff telling us sometimes the opposite, and how do you kind of balance that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a rule for this. I think that we have to live our lives exercising prudence, and prudence is both a natural virtue and an infused virtue. At baptism, our natural capacity for prudential thought and reasoning and action is assumed and transformed and superseded by its supernatural counterpart. And so, as Christians, we believe that we have a share in divine prudence, and we have to exercise that throughout our lives in order to try and work out what would be appropriate and what wouldn't. I agree with you. I think that part of the role of the clergy in the church is to teach us and to offer leadership. But as much of the church's history has illustrated and demonstrated, and certainly the 20th century has demonstrated very powerfully, the clergy can definitely get things wrong. And one of the problems with I suppose the dominant culture in the Catholic Church at the moment is that it does seem to be, and I'm not talking about everyone, I'm just saying that there's a trend here that is identifiable, that culture does seem to be a hysterical one. It seems to be one that's characterized by a great deal of fear and a kind of hysteria, and it belongs to us to prudentially identify whether we are receiving some really sound and important teaching that we need to take note of, or that we are that we're privy to a kind of hysteria here, or something in between. And that is something that it belongs to the faithful to try and work out. I quote a priest in the book who says that no Christian should ever own crystals, that they are, I think he refers to them as a New Age thing. It's a New Age thing. But, Albert the Great wrote extensively about the healing properties and the importance of crystals and the divine power that they hold. Hildegard, obviously, book 4 of the Physica. These are two doctors of the church, of course, who both are writing extensively about crystals, particularly Hildegard. And Hildegard has an entire angelology about their significance and their power. And, if she's right, and she was a great holy woman whom I have a very particular affection for, then it shouldn't surprise us that these crystals, and not just them, but many things in the mineral world, come to us as healing things, or they have healing properties, or they place us in a relaxed state. In fact, if I remember correctly, the priest that I quote was responding to a woman who was simply saying that she found them very peaceful or relaxing to have them around. And he sort of said, well, look, if you find these relaxing, that's an indication that there's something spiritually wrong with you. Well, I think Hildegard would have said something very different, actually, in that regard. So it belongs to us to try and make sense of that. And, I'm fond of quoting what Archbishop Fulton Sheen, the American Archbishop, who was often on the television, used to say, which is, whatever the church throws out, the world will pick up. So a lot of the things that actually, at various times in the church's history, were considered completely normative, indigenous to Catholic practice, now we consider New Age, right? And that might be because over time we've discerned they don't have a place in the church, but it's more likely that actually, because of the incremental concessions that we've made to rationalistic modern thought, these things just don't play a role in the Catholic Weltanschauung anymore. But that doesn't mean that that's a problem with them. That means there's a problem with us, and and maybe we should have them back. So, yeah, I mean, I see a church so often gripped by fear. Recently, I went on a pilgrimage with members of my family. I walked from Wells Cathedral to Glastonbury Tor, both of these areas, which are quite close together. You can do it in a single day. Have very are of enormous sacred significance in British history. And the next day, I was back in Wells, and I met up with a chap called Tom Bree, who wrote a book called Cosmos in Stone, on the underlying sacred geometry of Wells Cathedral. And Wells Cathedral is one of the finest examples of English Gothic medieval architecture. And as you walk from the nave into the chapter house of the cathedral, and you bear in mind what the chapter house is, so, as I'm sure your listeners will know, the chapter house is called the chapter house because every day the monks gathered there to listen to a chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict. So they're listening to it being read by their abbatial superior day in, day out. And as you process from the church into the chapter house, which is itself a kind of marvel because it's tilted towards the sanctuary at exactly the same number of degrees as the moon to the earth, so the whole thing maps on to the cosmos itself, you see, and of course that it symbolizes Our Lady, who has the moon under her feet at the apocalypse, etc. So the whole of the building is mapping on to the theophanic nature of the cosmos. So the cathedral ends up becoming an incarnation of the whole cosmos, which could then liturgically be offered back to the Creator. So the whole cathedral in the liturgy becomes an oblation. Again, like the modern mind has completely lost this sense, but this is just totally normal to how our medieval forebears thought. Anyway, as you process from the nave to the chapter house, you pass this pillar, and on the top of this pillar is a column. Is a capital on top of the column, and the capital has a salamander crawling out of flames. Okay, Now, this is not a biblical image. Okay, this is an alchemical image. The salamander emerging out of the flames is a symbol in alchemy of esoteric alchemy. So exoteric alchemy is obviously the reduction of base metal through the philosopher's stone to materia prima, so that it can be brought back into the corporeal domain with a new form imposed so it's the divine metal, namely gold. Right? That's alchemical exoterica. Alchemical esoterica, to which the exoteric dimension was always understood to be connected, was the idea that the transmutation of lead or some other base metal into gold was a performative expression of the interior alchemical process by which you die to self through discovering the illusion of the self, and you're brought back into being through this purgative experience, through the purgation of the flames, into new life, which is where you yourself don't live, but he lives within you, namely your creator. And so your selfhood is derived from your moral interrelatedness with your own creator. And the symbol for this was the salamander emerging out of the flames, because, of course, salamanders would take refuge in wet wood, and if you were camping out, you would throw a log onto the wood, and the salamander would scurry out because it was getting too hot in there. And often people thought that the salamander that might have been in the wood had been consumed by the flames and died and had been reborn out of them, much like a phoenix. These are all alchemical icons, okay, and they're part of the idiom and the lexicon and the vernacular of the medieval world. Now, look, I mean, if you tried to stick an alchemical icon on a cathedral today, people would absolutely go ballistic, right? They would think that you are trying to corrupt the faith with occultism or, the New Age or whatever, right? And the point I'm trying to make by way of this little example is that maybe the medievals were wrong to put a salamander on top of a column outside the chapter house. That's possible. Nonetheless, it's indicative of the fact that this is not a religious practice or a religious way of life that is characterized by constant fear and terror, that somehow we're straying into the diabolical whenever we're just assuming and making our own the wider wisdom tradition of the West, and indeed how that emerges in other sapiential traditions, with which, of course, the Church has always been in dialogue down the centuries in any case. So I just think people need to relax a little bit, probably.
Yeah. It's like the gargoyles too, right? Like a lot of Gothic cathedrals on the outside were the gargoyles, and it was kind of a representation that it says, like, if you kind of retreat from the center of when you go out there, that's where, at the farther you get from the center of town, that's where the monsters and stuff are outside of it. And so it's a representation of the exterior being surrounded by monsters, but you go inside and it's you go into the center of the world, which is where the altar and the sacrifice of the mass is going to be served. Now, we're kind of getting close to time, but I want to see if we can possibly squeeze one more topic in here, because I find it very interesting too. And it's kind of, and I think it's a good segue into this, because there's a different way that there's the highest forms of participation, you can say, is, the worship and the liturgies and the mass. But then there's lower things below us that kind of are a bridge between, like, our everyday and the mass in the middle, right? And so something like fairy tales, storytelling, the saints, things like that kind of are that bridge that helps us or the bridge between like heaven and earth, you can say, in the world. And so you used to have something that you have the liturgical calendar. Obviously, you used to have forms of prayer. So there used the East still kind of does this. I don't know many people, many in the West that do this in terms of like praying Vespers in the evening versus just doing a mass, or having more prayer associated liturgies or services, whereas in the West everything seems to be a mass. Like when you go, it's a holy day of obligation, or you go in the evening on Saturday, it's always like a mass. You don't have kind of more of these prayer routines that were associated with it anymore. And then I feel like that kind of separates us from the older stories as well, in terms of you hear stories in terms of like Saint Patrick turning into a deer, right, to sneak past the pagans to be able to go to church to worship. Or you have this Irish saint called Saint Murrigan, that's a mermaid saint, right? And I feel like those different prayer services and like this aspect of, you can say, I guess, monasticism helps us understand those saints in terms of the odd or the weird, whereas having everything so structured, just being mass all the time, or as you said, kind of like this disconnect of seeing a alchemy sign or gargoyles at the end makes us feel uneasy. And with in your book, you kind of associate this problem of clericalism, I guess you would say, where we used to interact with the monks and stuff, and the monks and the laity would live together, and the faith was spirit there. Now that all evolved into clericalism, where now you even have a lot of monks that are also priests, and so there's not even much separation there. Can you kind of, I guess, talk about that, and how maybe the theurgy and some of the stuff we are talking about were a little lost in there as well?
Yes, I suppose the main point that I make about the importance of monasticism in the history of the church is that the church, through its monastic charism, which was always very much at the heart of Christian life for centuries and centuries, the church was focused on sanctifying a place. So monasteries would be established, villages would emerge around those monasteries or nearby those monasteries. The monks would descend at various times of the year to bless the fields and bless the hedgerows. In Northern Europe, they would even bless packs of hounds before the hunting season began, and that's how the holy masses for St. Hubert and so on emerged. So there's a long tradition in the church of focusing on the sanctification of place. And what this meant was that historically, and I give various reasons for why I claim this, Christians understood themselves as primarily liturgical beings. They didn't understand themselves primarily as beings who had propositionally assented. Now, because of the very rationalistic, dialectical mind of modern people, often when I say this, they say, "Oh, you think propositions aren't important? You think doctrine's not important?" No, I'm not saying that. Obviously, believing what God says about Himself is absolutely essential. But the metaphor I use in the book is, it's a prerequisite for my marriage to work that I believe truths about my wife and disbelieve untruths about my wife. But if I were to think that that was the relationship, that my relationship was reducible to simply assenting to truths about my wife and disbelieving untruths about my wife, then I would have a kind of very strange conception of what the marital covenant is about, right? Which is actually my relationship with my wife, and the same can be said of any kind of friendship. And what the purpose of the new covenant is to bring us out of enmity with God and into friendship with God, as the New Testament says. And so yes, we must believe the doctrine, absolutely. But that is not the Christian life. The Christian life is being in sacramental ongoing communion with God and being transformed by that relationship, so that, as Aquinas says, we too can become gods. What seems to have happened, and I give a kind of overview of the historiography here and how I think this happened. But over the centuries, we moved from the idea of the Christian being a liturgical creature, a doxological being, that becomes so by residing in a sanctified place, to a conception of the Christian as one who assents to a list of propositional formulae, and does so because he receives certain instruction, and then the monastic life makes less and less sense. And of course, in the age of rationalism, what you get is a huge attack on the contemplative monastic life. And Joseph von Habsburg, the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of course, went around trying to dissolve as many monastic foundations as possible, because he just couldn't possibly see the point of it, right? And then you get to the point in our own age where the monastic life, even though it's really the heart of Christian spirituality, the monastic life has kind of really disappeared from our purview altogether, and we think of things almost exclusively in terms of the laity receiving preaching from a cleric who probably won't be there in a year or two because the bishops move them every 5 minutes. And so everything is in flux. Everything, nothing has the sense of permanence. Each time a new cleric comes, it's almost as if you have to change your religion, because you never know what he himself assents to or dissents from, or what indeed are his liturgical tastes. And so modernity, that is this process of deracination and constant fluctuation, that keeps us in a kind of constant state of anxiety, that ends up having its own kind of analogue within ecclesiastical culture, which is sort of what we've ended up with now. So one of the reasons why I talk about theurgy and this ancient Mediterranean practice, that was, if you like, the kind of practical side of the Neoplatonic schools in the early centuries, is that I'm trying to look at what it is to be a kind of doxological being, to understand our nature, if you like, as first and foremost doxological, and then I'm trying to look at how grace assumes and perfects that and transforms it, so that we, if you like, in the state of nature, we're kind of longing for this fulfilled theurgical experience, and that becomes fulfilled in the Christian liturgical life. Although, unfortunately, that, as I've been insisting, much violence has been done to that of late. But hopefully, we're going through a crisis that will come to an end.
Yeah, there's a mystery in that. Of it's almost like in the Fight Club books of, like, you don't talk about Fight Club. There's just certain things in the faith you almost can't talk about because there's a mystery behind it. In terms of you saying agreeing to certain propositions, I can't imagine meeting somebody and them telling me, in order to be my friend, you have to meet me at least three times a month. You have to believe X, Y, Z, and then I can be then we can have this relationship, instead of it being this natural flow of just the rituals and stuff that were passed down in order to do friendships, or what I learned from my parents to do so. But
well, it's interesting, because I actually know somebody who was thinking about joining the legionaries of Christ, the religious order founded by Marcel Marcial, who of course turned out to be a crook. And he was thinking about joining them. This is years ago now, a long time ago. And he got to know this legionary priest, and they would have coffee occasionally, and the priest would tell him about life in the legionaries. And this was... he formed, a good relationship and was seriously thinking about joining the legionaries. And then one day he met him for coffee, and there was a different priest there. And he said, "Oh, where's Father Smith?" or whatever his name was. He said, "Oh, he's been sent somewhere else on a mission. He won't be coming back. I'm going to be your friend from now on." These people had been so stripped of their own personhood, their own uniqueness, that they had themselves come to believe, well, if I keep the rule, I assent to all the same things, I do all the same things as my confreres, I am completely and utterly interchangeable and transferable with everyone else in the order, so I can do this. Whereas this chap, of course, believed that he had actually made a connection with a concrete individual who was not interchangeable with anyone else, and I mean that is a sign of extreme spiritual sickness that such a view had come into that religious congregation. But that's symptomatic of the kind of abstractionism and rationalistic epistemology that I think has just infected the whole modern world and that I rail against over and over again. And it saddens me enormously that that this has become part of the culture of the modern church. I mean, when the scripture time and again talks about the fact that we are called by name, that when our Lord says, I don't call you servants anymore, I call you my friends, that he speaks to each by name, that Mary Magdalene only recognizes him in the resurrected state when he says her name. This absolute, it's almost like we can only really be fully persons because we are recipients of this grace. And so to empty the church of that dynamic is an incredible sacrilege and desecration that most of us seem to be completely blind to, precisely because we're under that hex. I think a great work of spell breaking needs to be done.
I agree completely. So to wrap up, once again, this is your book here, Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries, some of the topics we talked about from here. So, where can people get this book? And if you have any other writings or the way people can follow along and read your other works, where can they go to kind of like follow along with what you do?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that book is published by Oz Justi Press, Peter Kwasniewski's publishing house, which produces many excellent books. And, Peter is one of the great shining lights, I think, in the church today. And he's offering a lot of people a lot of clarity. So, you can get the book from the Oz Justi website, or I think from Amazon. And I've just recently brought out a new book with Angelico Press, which is this book here. I don't know if you can see it.
Woodland Philosophy. Yep.
Yeah, Woodland Philosophy. which is all about, I suppose, the spirituality of hunting and outdoorsmanship, and I suppose it's the spirituality of the primordial book of Revelation, the theophany of the cosmic order, and how to have a participatory relationship with it through our great ancestral skills. So I talk about foraging, mushroom hunting, deer stalking, hunting with hounds, the practice of archery, all the things that I've tried to fill my life with so as not to become just another opinion blurting bot on a screen. That's what the book is about. So it's a book that's very close to my heart, woodland philosophy. A lot of the insights that have had, I suppose, serious practical consequences for my life are put into that book. So I hope my readers enjoy it.
Yeah, I hope so too. And once again, this is the other book that we were talking about. And as a quick note, I got a steel mace after reading this book, and I actually have it sitting right there back there. For anyone who doesn't get it, you'll have to read the book. But yeah,
great stuff. Oh, good. Right.